So good morning, everybody. My name is Leslie Carpenter, and I am a former board member at NAMI Johnson County. And I am very thrilled today to be able to introduce our invited guest. Dr. Judith Smith is somebody whom I met after being referred to her by somebody at NAMI National, who I do some work on teaching NAMI provider with. Dr. Smith is an associate professor at the Graduate School of Social Services at Fordham University. She lives in New York City with her husband. She's a leader in gerontological, easy for me to say, research, focusing on women's experiences as they age. She's a senior clinical social worker, a psychotherapist, professor, and researcher. She's used her mental health and child development knowledge in the production of educational films, academic publications, and now this book that she's here to speak with us about today, called Difficult: Mothering Challenging Adult Children Through Conflict and Change. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce my friend Judith.
Thank you, Leslie. I'm really glad to be here. I am going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to have time for questions. So if you get a question, just put it in the chat, and then Mary will be sharing them with me later. Okay, so as Leslie showed you, this is my book, and you can get it all the places that you buy books, Amazon or other local things. And why is this not moving? Okay, so this is an overview of what I'm going to be sharing with you. I'm going to be talking about what is an unrecognized social problem, how older women, mothers, are serving as a default safety net for their troubled adult children. And I interviewed many women who shared with me the personal cost that they are paying to help care for their adult children, and how this family situation highlights gaps in federal and state supports for dependent and vulnerable adults. So who I am, I started my career as a child development person and did lots of studies and research about the early mother-child relationship. And then I got older and I became a gerontologist. I got interested in later life development. And I took my child development lens and was really curious about what colleagues had been writing about mothering in later life. And we know so much about child development. I mean, if anybody remember bookstores, we used to have bookstores, and you'd walk in and there was, many, many shelves of books about mothers of infants, a few shelves of mothers of school age, one shelf of mothers of teens, but mothers of adult children, that really is not a topic that people have looked at. There's sort of an assumption they grow up, they launch, and then they're gone. But is this really, how mothers experience mothering, and how different is this when an adult child has mental health or substance use challenges? I was really shocked at how little my academic colleagues had done about mothering in later life. I did finally find, before I started my research, work by Carl Pillemer and his group. He's a human development researcher, and they had done a large study of, all parents across the United States, and found that in terms of adult children, parents were more depressed and had higher feelings of ambivalence about their adult children if their kids were not succeeding in various ways, if they weren't married, if they hadn't finished school, or if they had problems with substance or mental illness. So I was pleased to find somebody who was really talking about that adult kids' problems affected parents, whether they had mental illness or not, that parents' sense of self is affected by how their kids are doing. So I began a qualitative research study to look at mothering in later life and to find out. Qualitative researchers come in with an open mind to discover how people really see this issue, because nobody else had talked about it yet. So I went to senior centers, I went to unions, and I recruited people to, wanting older people over 55 to talk to me about problems in their adult kids' lives that affected them. I didn't know what anyone would talk to me about. Were they going to tell me they were upset because their kids weren't visiting enough, or they'd married the wrong person? Or was it more extreme, like elder abuse? They were physically or emotionally abusing their parents. I didn't know. So many of you I saw this one dad on this call. Many of you may be saying, well, why did I just do moms? Well, first of all, it was a small study, a small sample, and I had to restrict the number of variables I could use. But I also had a theoretical reason for doing it, is that I don't really see caregiving or parenting as gender neutral. I do think that if you look at the data, most people who are caregivers of their parents or caregivers of their spouses and caregivers of their adult children, the primary demographic is a mom or female or a daughter. So what I did is people who I screened, who had told me they were interested, I set up 2 interviews with them, an hour and a half each, in person or on Zoom once the pandemic began, and asked them to talk about the ups and downs of being a mom to this child. And I began the first interview. I didn't want to walk in and say, tell me about the problems of your adult child, because I knew this is not an easy topic to talk about. Most people do not want to share with others, particularly strangers, how their adult child has been a problem for them. So I really spent the whole first interview talking about what the pregnancy was like, how they were in school, and this developed a trust between us, and people had I'm also a mom, and shared that, and that we could, together have a sense of the mother's strengths as a mom. And then in the second interview, we focused on the problems with the adult child. So what did they tell me? It wasn't that their kids weren't calling enough. What they were talking about, upset that their adult child had not reached their potential, that many used the word disrespectful. They were disrespectful to their mother. They were upset about the adult child's difficulty in romantic relationships. Some talked about how their child had been aggressive to the mom herself and to others, psychiatric problems, substance use problems, being unemployed, and having no place to live. And as I analyzed, the way I taped everything, and then I listened to the interviews over and over again, and I realized all of these items in Black really were related also to mental illness and substance use. That these were the parents who came forward and wanted to talk to me about how their adult children's problems were affecting them. Each of the people I talked to had opened their homes to be in my study. Your adult child had to have left. So I was not interviewing parents who knew right after the birth that their child would be disabled and they would be with them for the rest of their lives. Everybody in my study, their adult child had to have left for a brief period. And what I found with everyone who talked to me is that the moms had opened their homes and wanted to provide a place to live for their adult child when they got into a crisis. There were a few affluent women in my study who were able to get a separate, had the resources to get a separate home for their adult child. But most of the low income and middle class parents could not afford this and had to bring their kids into their homes, which caused a lot of the problems. But even for Jillian, who had moved her daughter 21 times in 20 years, her life was not free of stress, even though she could afford putting her child in a separate residence. Jillian, who moved her child 21 times in 20 years, said, I feel like I'm a mule being held back by a harness. The harness was her commitment to providing shelter and safety to her daughter, Celia, who had had her first psychiatric break at 22. The next 20 years in Jillian's life were framed by finding and refinding new apartments for her daughter. Her friends thought that Jillian doing the same thing over and over again was pointless. They saw how unhappy Jillian was. But other friends said, well, of course Jillian has to do that. She's a good mother. But when Jillian said, look, Celia needs to eat, she needs a place to live. So as I listened to everyone's story, Jillian was very different than Loretta, who had no resources. I found some commonalities. And I tried to, as a qualitative researcher, you try to come up with themes or words to describe what you were hearing. And I chose the term difficult adult child to describe what the mothers were experiencing and what they were telling me about. And this was a name I chose to both describe the challenges faced by the grown children, but also the hardships that were being passed along to the mothers who cared for them. There may be some adult children who are in this audience who may be sitting here saying, what is she doing? Is Dr. Smith calling me difficult? Am I saying that the adult children are the problem? I'm not. I'm really, as in every family relationship, there's the parent's point of view and there's the adult child's perspective. And I'm surprised that there's not been more research about adults, young adults and older adults with mental health challenges perspective on family relationships. This really ought to be done because clearly, all adult kids see the world differently than their parents, because adult kids are trying to be independent and parents are trying to hold on to their treasured, children. But I was focusing on the moms and what they were telling me. And what I found was difficult mothering, which is part of difficult adult child, happened when the adult children got into a situation where they could no longer support themselves and they had no place to live. That's when really difficult mothering began. And it's both a personal problem and it's reflected a structural gap that there were really not services for their adult children, places for them to live safely. So difficult adult child may seem to some as a harsh label, one that maybe even blames, not just identifies them. But I looked up the term in the dictionary, and the dictionary defines difficult as when something is hard to do or carry out, when something is hard to deal with, manage, or overcome, and difficult is something that's hard to understand. And what I heard from every mom is that mothering a vulnerable adult child is hard to do. Tolerating the tensions in relationship with a struggling adult child is extremely hard to manage. And understanding the problems that might have caused your child's situation are hard, and knowing how to intervene can feel impossible. Sociologists use the term linked lives, how for all family relationships, what happens in one person's life affects the other generations. So with adult children, if there's a psychiatric break or a serious substance use disorder, which then results in unemployment, breakup of relationships, leaving college, the person not being able to afford housing, then they turn back to their family. And all the moms in my sample had allowed their adult child to move back in. Most thought it was temporary. And what the stories revealed, that living together again was not easy. And things that moms talked about were sort of the daily problems that occurred. The adult child taking mom's food. I mean, half of my sample were low-income moms. So somebody living on a fixed budget, she has food ready for that evening, and then her adult child takes that for himself. The adult child not using their money from SSI to bring in groceries. The adult child keeping hours that don't respect the older mom's need for quiet. Lack of cleanliness was a constant fight. And it got worse as one young man tried to have his mother evicted from her own home. He believed it was his. And then it could get even worse, where the boundary violations, were really physical aggression. Moms reported being physically knocked down by their kids, having a knife pulled on them, being strangled by her daughter. One mom allowed her son to come home from prison, and the next day he stole her television and jewelry. So living together again has been shown in the literature on elder abuse as a possible trigger for what is known as elder abuse. And in the elder abuse literature, the primary perpetrator for aggressive acts towards older men and women is a dependent adult child who's living in the home, financially dependent on the parents, and has mental health and substance use issues. Most elder abuse cases do not get reported. Parents feel shame that their own child is attacking him, and they also fear that their adult child will only be further hurt if the police are called. I've written one article where I talk about that I don't think elder abuse is a good term because none of us think of ourselves as elder. And none of the women I talked to, even though they'd been using elder abuse services, use the word abuse. They use the word disrespectful, aggressive, but no mother talked to me saying that her child was abusive. Here's Doreen, who was 72. She was a tiny little woman who had Parkinson's disease. She said to me, we need to be separated. I don't need all this in my age, in my life, but I don't want to see him, have homeless or whatever, because he won't survive. He won't survive. He will not survive. So that's what I feel, that there's fear that harm would come for him. I mean, that could come to me too, but I just fear harm coming to him. So Doreen was living with her neighbors, and her other kids were saying, throw him out, throw him out. He had pulled a knife on her. He's a big guy. But she's telling me, I'm not going to do that. It's going to be too dangerous for him, and I am going to prioritize his safety over mine. And I heard this conflict of whose needs should take priority from every single person I talked to. And one psychologist has called conflicts of mothering of being torn in two in terms of whose needs take priority. I met a woman in an aging services place where she had come to get legal advice to have her 52-year-old daughter and grandson, both who had bipolar, evicted because the doctor had told her her blood pressure was going to kill her. She needed to stop the stress in her life. I then interviewed her right after she met with a lawyer, and she said, I'm still trying to help, but at the same time, I can't keep on leaving myself out. I have to help myself. I'm at a crossroads here. I have to stand up to them. At the same time, I have to understand they have real problems. But I have to understand that no matter what, I want to help them. I don't want to give up on them. If I step back, something could happen, and I'd be sorry that I didn't continue to try to help working with them. So after we spoke, I knew she was not going to kick them out. Her decision was she was going to keep working with them. And 2 years later, her daughter was able to move on to independent living. But not all the moms were able to continue to have their kids living with them. Tracy was someone who told me that she was told by everybody in the hospital, by every social worker, that she could not allow her daughter to move back into her home. The daughter had set fires 2 times in her mother's home. She had physically attacked her mom. And so they found a shelter near the house for persons with mental illness, but the daughter didn't like the shelter. So she was living literally out in the park right next to Tracy's house. Tracy described feeling terribly torn. She herself was someone even when she got married, she wasn't sure she wanted to get married. She wanted to travel, but she got married and said, when they grow up, I'm going. And then they grew up and her daughter had serious mental illness. And when I met her, she was just completely torn about what do I do? So for Tracy, there was a tug between freedom and responsibility. She said, you're, meaning herself, being selfish if you want to move on with your life. Everyone says you must stay there for Jeannie, her daughter. But then I tell myself, how are you going to be there for anyone else? I have 2 other girls. The role model I was set that you give up all your dreams. So she was really torn. I don't know what she ultimately decided. So what's her mother to do? Society is now expecting women to be the unpaid and unrecognized caregiver for vulnerable adults in our society. What are the choices that mothers have, and how do they live with what they decide? So I have asked Leslie if she would be willing to tell us her story, and she lived with this dilemma.
Okay, so as many of you on this call know, I have a son with a very serious mental illness, and he tried to live with us many, many times, and also in the community in apartments with, community services, which means a college student who's trained on the job to stop by like maybe for an hour, 2 or 3 days a week, right? But our son was way too sick to be able to handle that. And, thankfully, I got to NAMI. My husband and I took the family to family class in 2015. And at that time, that's when we started learning that, we really needed to learn about setting limits, right? About what we could tolerate in our home and what we couldn't tolerate in our home. And, that's easy to say and really, really hard to implement with somebody who's currently in a psychosis, which is how our son almost always was every single time he came home from the hospital over his 26 hospitalizations, because we all know people don't come home from a hospital stable. And, ultimately we did start setting limits, but in 2016, when he had experienced his worst psychosis, what really caused me to decide that, hey, we really, really cannot allow him to live in our home anymore was when I had visited him at the hospital and he had started taking medication, and the docs thought, hey, he's looking a little bit better. He hasn't been outside in over a month since he's been here. Would you please take him out for an on-campus pass? And I took him for a walk on campus at the University of Iowa's hospital, right? And initially it started out fine. He was making jokes. I got him a sandwich in the cafeteria and it was going really well. We went outside and he turned to me and he said, oh my God, that sun feels so great on my face, Mom. Thanks so much for taking me out for this walk. And, of course I said, yes, I'm sorry that we haven't been able to do this sooner. And we kept walking, and then some birds flew across our path. And his whole affect completely changed. His eyes changed. And he turned to me and he said, Mom, the voices are telling me I need to kill you right now. And it was that quick. And then we turned a corner, and then there was somebody that he knew, somebody we both knew. And he turned back to being like he had been before, laughing, interacting with this couple that we knew, and everything was normal. And then we kept walking and some more birds crossed our paths and he changed again. It was during that walk and the fear about not being able to get him back into the hospital before something happened to me that I realized that this could happen to us. You read about these stories all the time in the paper and on the internet about a family member being killed by their own child, and you think that'll never happen to me. My child's never been violent. Well, that day I realized, of course this could happen to me. This is how it is. This is what happens. Those voices take over. And we finally did come to the decision that we needed to no longer allow our son to live with us. And that's a really hard decision, right? No mom wants to have to say that to their own child. But as long as he was still living with us, we weren't really getting him the help that he needed. And we really were suffering as well. A specific example of that was I needed a hysterectomy for about a year and a half. I put up with symptoms where it took my hematocrit down to like 4 for a very long time. And you don't really realize that you're doing this, that you're putting off your own needs until it becomes emergent and it becomes much more of a dire situation than it needed to be. And the thing is that we hear from families all the time. There are so many families right here in our own community and all across the country where they feel stuck and they feel like they're really in this choice of, well, if I kick my child out, they're going to end up homeless or in prison or dead. But those aren't really the only two choices. And while you're in the midst of it, it's really hard to see that there are possibilities for figuring out other housing situations, other treatment situations. And thankfully, NAMI has been a big piece of helping me to see that. And Judith in her book outlines a lot more resources than I would have ever thought of from my background as a NAMI person and as a mental health advocate here in Iowa. She outlines services such as aging services, such as, the Ombudsman for long-term care, so many other sources of help than I would have thought of. And, during the years that we were going through this, I never would have categorized that what we were experiencing was trauma. I never did until I took provider training. And then I realized, oh my God, yes, we had had trauma for years because of our son's illness, not because of him, but because of his illness. And honestly, also because of the way mental health providers would treat us all, right? And I know there's people in this room that recognize that. So what I want to say to you is that you don't have to be stuck in that position. You have to make a choice, but you can find services for both and move on to have a better life. And then you'll be better at supporting your loved one because you'll be healthier yourself. So I'll stop there, Judith.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I hadn't heard before from you about the putting off the hysterectomy. So, okay. So I just have a little bit more and then we're going to take questions. So really, this raises the question like the costs that Leslie and her husband were bearing and that many people here may be living with to this day. I think we have an unspoken social policy in our country that families should be the cornerstone for our mentally ill people. And is this right? Is this really a public responsibility or a private responsibility? Should parents be the backbone for vulnerable adults' needs for housing and other care? So I really entered this project as a psychotherapist, a clinical person wanting to see how mothers viewed mothering in later life. And I came away really with my policy thinking that this is really a crisis of we need affordable housing. We need, I think Thomas Insel's book on healing is very helpful. He was the head of NIMH. He says our mental health system is a crisis in care, that it is not a system. And although we have on the books parity of mental health and physical health care, this has not yet happened. And as a result, each parent, everybody sitting here, is living with this on a very daily personal basis. So my book also talks about change. And I think, as Leslie said, to try to break through this idea that it's either me or him, that either he'll be homeless or she'll be in jail. There are ways to slowly begin to find other ways to think about this. Obviously, as parents, we're not magicians. I think one problem is, and thinking about this through the eyes of mothers, that we believe we should be able to do everything. And we believe we should have created perfect kids, and we feel responsible if we didn't. Every single mom told me it was her fault that her child had these problems. But slowly realizing it's not your fault. There are two people in this situation, and there's also a mental health system that we need to rely on. But in the book, I give you ways to begin to take small steps to think about making changes for yourself and small things you can do. The kind of changes that I talk about, one is to see how depressed you are, because living with the trauma, as Leslie has talked about, makes us depressed. So I have a depression screening in the book. I suggest to people to take it and bring it to your doctor, because depression is treatable. That's one thing that can be done. And that social support, every article on depression and women's mental health or anyone's mental health, we need social support. So NAMI, you all have taken those steps already. You're already in NAMI. You've already gotten on this call. Engaging in self-care, which is not taking a bubble bath. It's really getting yourself to a NAMI meeting. It is making time to see a friend. It's making sure you have your hysterectomy when you need it. And learning how to stay safe in your home. That's where I think social workers in elder abuse centers can help you come up with a plan. If you are living with an adult child who can be violent and you're not able to have them leave at this point, it is possible to learn how to be safe. And then in terms of, I have a chapter on helping your adult child. And I think you all know that that's not an easy thing to do. People have to be ready to want help. But if you know what the resources are at the right moment, you can say, hey, you know, I just saw there's a new substance abuse treatment center down the block. You want to go down and look at it today. You find your moments. So I would love to be in touch with you. I'm looking forward to the questions. I can put in the chat my contact information, and I'd like to continue the dialogue. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to the questions. Mary, do we have questions?
Well, not yet. So type away, folks, in the chat if you have a question. But thank you so much for sharing your information. And I appreciate you talking about how NAMI is a support, because here at NAMI Johnson County, we do have a peer recovery drop-in center that's open Monday through Friday, 1 to 5, for people to drop in and get that support that they need.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So I have a question here. How do you talk to your child about boundaries you set and the reason for them?
Well, I think just doing them, you know, I think you talk about that you need to feel safe and you want them to feel safe, that you know that they don't want to hurt you and you don't want them to hurt you, because then it will make living together even more difficult. But I don't know if it's as important to talk about them as to do them, and to really be able to say, this is what we need to, if we're talking about living together or money or whatever the issues are. I think you'll find the words. It's sort of finding within yourself the ability to do it, because it often can feel mean. But if you realize you're really not coming from a mean place, you're really coming from a place, because if you get hurt or if all your resources are drained, you're not going to be any help to them.
Can I add in a couple things on this?
Please.
Okay, so one of the things that has been the most helpful thing to me said to me was by Teresa Graham Minor, who some of you might know up in Cedar Rapids. She recommends the broken record approach. Every time the issue comes up that you're trying to set your boundary about, just giving the same answer as quickly and succinctly and consistently as possible. So no, I'm sorry, that isn't something we're going to tolerate in our home. No, I'm sorry, I love you, but I can't tolerate that. The broken record, and it sounds really difficult to do, but it works by being consistent about doing it every single time. And like she said, it is really about doing it. You do have to have the conversation, but keeping it short and very specific is what I would recommend.
What is her name?
Oh, Teresa Graham Meinert. She is an amazing soul who works in the mental health space in Cedar Rapids.
So Judith, another question is, does your book provide tips for parents on how to set boundaries?
I can't hear you.
Oh, I must be, sorry, my computer, if I'm off screen, it doesn't pick up my mic. The next question is, does your book provide tips for parents on how to set boundaries or how to set limits?
I give examples of when parents did that, but I don't have the tips. I mean, I think it's, the women's stories of those who were able to set limits show are the tips, and I think there's one woman's story that really illustrates the dangers of never setting boundaries. And she is going to spend the rest of her life in an elder abuse shelter, which is part of a nursing home, because she was incapable. I mean, she ended up being sexually abused by her child as well. She could not set any boundaries. And if you can't set any boundaries, I mean, she ended up having to leave her home and will never be able to see her son. So it's really dangerous to not be able to remember that there's two people here and that you need to be intact in order to be a good parent.
The next question is, how do mothers deal with mother's guilt?
We live with it. I think this is an issue for every mother. And I think that it's a big part of my book. And I think part of what I ended up thinking is the importance of understanding how this is it's in the water that we drink, that we believe women and mothers are responsible for everything. And interestingly, evolutionary biologists, I didn't even know there was such a thing until I started doing this project. I said initially, guilt helped the survival of the species, that women do feel guilt. You notice women don't throw their babies up in the air. It's just not part of our DNA. And this has been, when going back, thousands, millions of years, mothers' lack of aggressiveness towards their babies kept the species going. But it had an evolutionary piece, but women do experience more guilt than men, plus the society piece of mothers believe that we should be able to do everything. And I have a whole chapter that we even shame each other. I know I do it. I ride the subway every day, and if I see a mom, being mean to her kid, I immediately start blaming her. So we have to be aware of our own internalized idea that we should be perfect, and challenge society. So as Leslie said, mental health professionals can make us feel like it's our fault. So we have to be aware of our own tendency to blame ourselves and society's blaming us, and try to come up with more realistic options for what we can do and try to get help elsewhere.
And can I give the NAMI answer on it too?
Sure.
So remember that mental illnesses and substance use disorders are no fault disorders. They're not the fault of the person. They're not the fault of the parents. They are no fault disorders. And the best way to deal with guilt is to grant yourself grace. Grant yourself grace for not knowing when things were coming on and that you didn't intervene earlier. Grant yourself grace for not knowing all the resources when you first had this happen in your family. And grant yourself grace for not being perfect. Even when we do know things, we still don't consistently execute every single time. And we need to learn to forgive ourselves. And, it is not the mom's fault. I can't say that strongly enough.
Thank you.
Thank you for your responses. The next question is, we bought a small house for our daughter. Oh, yeah, we bought a small house that our daughter rents from us. At 88, I need to leave the landlord role. The house could be put in a trust for her, but I am concerned then about who will keep an eye on her to be sure she gets to the hospital when she needs it.
I think Jillian, the mom who I talked to you about before, who moved her kid 21 times, she described the last stage of mothering and later life of a challenging adult children is what happens after I'm gone. And she was shocked that she has resources. They found a bank that will be the fiduciary person, but where do you find someone who's really going to do all you have done? And I think, it goes to siblings. This is a problem we have not yet figured out. She said, isn't there a social worker who would like a private practice of doing this? And I'm not sure that can happen because all that you do, I don't think a social worker would take on. So this is a real problem. And, it becomes a sibling problem, and it should be a society problem. If we had the real supports, it would be like the loss of any parent would not be a calamity. So this is a real problem.
Our next question is, whose needs take priority? Do you have an answer in an abstract philosophical sense? I'm wondering how one decides this, especially given that the context is always changing.
I think that's so personal that each person has to decide that. And I think as mothers, we are trained and take on and love when our kids are babies, making their needs priority. But we assume that it's going to end at some point, it's going to become different. But when your kids are more vulnerable, this is what this is all about. It's difficult. There is not an easy answer to this. And each person has to, some people are comfortable living with prioritizing their adult child. Some people can't, as in Leslie's situation, but she hasn't abandoned her child. She sees him every week or whenever she can. So it's not an either or. I think there are a couple of books that have written that say, move on, you've done what you can. I did not find that from moms, that that's what they were willing to do or able to do. Leslie, what do you think?
I agree. I think it's possible to not have to make a choice between the two. And again, with family to family, what we teach people is to start with something small. If it's giving yourself one evening a week to go take a walk in the woods and scream to the universe, do that, start there, and then you can go on and figure it out. It doesn't mean that you're abandoning your child. It means that at least for that one evening, you're doing something to take care of yourself so you can be better when you are with your child, supporting them.
Would you remind us of the name of the book from the former head of the National Institute of Mental Health?
Oh, Healing. And his name is Thomas Insel, Insell.
Thank you. Our next question is, I have 3 adult children and 6 total adult children who suffer from mental illness, from bipolar, borderline personality disorder, and anxiety and depression. The personal involvement in a wide range of interactions is a real challenge. I often feel helpless and overwhelming for me.
Yes, I hope you're in a NAMI group. I think being able to talk about this, so many people, sometimes our friends and family don't want to hear about it anymore. And you are in an extremely difficult situation. And I just hope that you can find the support that you need and be able to talk to others. What do you think, Leslie?
I would agree. I think it really does help to get to the family to family class or the family support group or with your local religious leader that you might have a personal relationship with. Find somebody where you can get some support. It really does help. I can remember early on when people would say, you guys need to get to NAMI, I would say, but I'm not sick. I don't need that help. Because I didn't recognize that I desperately needed that help and that community. We all need a place and people to be with to support us, because while we may not be able to provide all the answers, it really does help to be in a room with other people who get it, where you don't have to explain the insanity of the broken system to take care of our loved ones. So that's where I would start.
Well, this ends oh wait, sorry, last minute, another question came in. Why do you say it becomes a sibling problem? After my death, growing up with difficult siblings has already taken a toll on these siblings. Is this justifiable?
It's not justifiable. It's again, the gap in our mental health system, in our safety gap system. We should have affordable housing. We should have housing that heals with supportive services. This is not how it should be. It's just that families fill in when there's a gap. But I think, I think Leslie's example of taking one's grief and frustration with what happened to your family and becoming an advocate for changing these policies, I think is what I'm hoping so many people will do. I mean, I am surprised where, I'm a clinical person and a policy person, but I did not write this book as a policy book. And I did not come into this project thinking it was a mental health issue. But this is a policy problem. And I hope, if you all have some space in your lives and some calm in your lives, I think our legislators need to hear from families, and we have to really put a face on the price that families are paying, that we can't continue to have an unspoken social policy that says that families should take this on. You can't do it alone. This is not, you can't solve this individually. And kids don't want to be dependent on their parents for their whole lives. I mean, we need to have housing, we need to have services, we need to have supportive workplaces. I think Incel in his book said, people need people, place, and the 3 P. It's purpose, place, and people. We have to provide opportunities for meaningful involvement and work. People need relationships beyond just their parents, and they need a place to live. So these are the things that, I think this book is leading me to become an advocate. And I hope other people, if you have the space, we only have a certain amount of energy, but if there ever becomes, I think Leslie is an example of how you can get energy and can really find purpose by taking what's been a personal tragedy and turning it into a situation where you can really make a difference. So just to remind you, the book is difficult, and I'm Judith R. Smith, and you can find it on Amazon. And if you like it, and I've just learned that it's really important to have lots of reviews on Amazon. So if you like it, please write a review, but just write to me and tell me if there are things you think I left out. And I'd love to hear from you. And I'm going to be doing a reading group on a monthly reading group where we can talk about some of these issues in detail. So if you send me your email, I will let you know about all that.
That's wonderful. Also for those, I know we probably have people across the country, but for people in Johnson County, we do have the book in our library that
Okay.
people can check out and read it. So our NAMI Johnson County Library, make that clear.
Uh-huh. Oh, your actual public library?
No, in our library here at NAMI Johnson County.
Okay, also, if you call your public library, they will order it. And that's a great way to get the book known by others. So I think on every website for your library, they say, what books do you want? If you just put it down, they will order it for you.
That's a wonderful idea. We have really good libraries here.
Great.
Thank you,
All right.
Judith, for coming today. We really appreciate you coming and sharing your information with us.
Well, I really appreciate being here, and I'm so glad that I found NAMI and I found Leslie, and it really has allowed me to be able to include in the resources and the change things that can really help, because this is a problem that's not easy, and knowing that NAMI exists, has been a lifesaver for me to be able to tell people about it. So thank you, everybody.